Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third event of the Northeast Health Work 2021 Symposium. This event is hosted by the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. My name is Alissa White. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the University of Vermont. I work with the Gund Institute and UVM Extension, and I am so pleased to kick off this event with just a short introduction to the network and this symposium. The Northeast Healthy Soils Network is really a diverse regional network that brings together stakeholders from government, academia, extension, and farming around shared interests in soil health. And this network was founded at Tufts University with a two-day in-person symposium that occurred just weeks before COVID-19 changed things in the Northeastern US. To continue to support these valuable connections and shared learning that the network enabled, a small group of core organizers coordinated a series of web panel and discussion events over the last 6 months. And I'd just like to acknowledge these people for making this possible and invite anyone else who's interested in planning future events to reach out to us. This group of organizers includes Anne-Marie Couture, who's a research associate at Tufts University, Julie Snorek, who's a research associate at Dartmouth College, Julie Davenson, who's a panelist today and executive director of Stonewall Farm, myself, as well as Stephen Kelledy, an advocate for soil health policy who works across the region, Josie Watson, who was really instrumental in getting the network started and continues to work on the network while balancing school and graduate programs at Yale and Vermont Law School. Sam Polzin, who just earned his master's degree from the Friedman School at Tufts, and Adam Cotton, who's a policy analyst at Food Solutions New England. The first event in this series that we put together was hosted by Tufts University to explore the impact of opportunities and challenges of COVID-19 on the regional food system, climate resilience, and soil health. The second event was hosted by Dartmouth College on designing payment for ecosystem services. And today, the Gund Institute, a third event, really focusing on how we measure healthy soils and ecological outcomes from healthy soils. So I'd just like to start this event by expressing gratitude for all the panelists who are sharing their time and perspectives today, and the people who made this event possible. Foremost, Stephen Posner, who's the policy director at the Gund Institute, who's really done a lot of the background work and is running the Zoom meeting right now, as well as Basil and Nora, who are staff at the Gund Institute. Although this event is virtual, the Gund Institute itself sits on land which for many years has served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these Vermont lands, and we remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to share in this place. So today we're going to hear a short panel of presentations with diverse approaches to measuring soil health, and then we'll have moderated discussion. So I just want to remind folks as I pass this on to our moderator, Heather Darby, that etiquette in this kind of event is to not share your video and to mute during the presentations. You can turn your video back on and we have discussion at the end, but we really just like to focus on each panelist as they're speaking. And so I think now I'm going to introduce Heather Darby, who's our moderator and host for the event today. Heather is an extension agronomist at the University of Vermont. Many of you may know her. She's a fellow at the Gund Institute. She's faculty in plant and soil science department here as well. And she's also a farmer. And she brings an appreciation for the hard work it takes to run a farm to her research and her work with farmers. Heather, thank you. The event is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Alissa, and everyone that has helped organize this wonderful 2-hour session that we're going to have today on measuring healthy soils and ecological outcomes. Certainly for myself, as Alissa mentioned, soil health is at the heart of my extension work with farmers and the applied research that I conduct out in the field. And it's just really exciting to not only see this overwhelming interest and motivation around soil health from the academic community, but also from the farming community. And it really, it's just so exciting, and to see farmers taking time out of their busy days the first week of June that are on this presentation right now, I think speaks volumes to the fact that this is really important to the farming community, the research community, the environmental community, to all of us. And so, great. Let's get the show started. We have a wonderful array of panelists that are going to talk about measuring healthy soils and ecological outcomes. 7 individuals today, 8 that are going to be talking about different work that they've been doing. And I want to dive right into that. Just a reminder that you can type questions into the chat box if you like, or sort of other comments. I mean, everybody's able to see it, and other people can respond to that. We will try to pick up those questions at the end, and then of course we do want to try to have an interactive session at the end. It's a little bit difficult with 100 people, but if you do have a question or a comment, something to add to the discussion, raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you'll be able to ask your question to the panelists, or again, provide some comments. So with that, we appreciate everybody keeping their self muted, and we will get started. So our first speaker this afternoon that is going to provide the welcome and some opening remarks for this wonderful event is Dr. Taylor Ricketts, who many of you I'm sure know. He is the director of the Gunn Institute for Environment, and he's also a professor in the Rubenstein School of Natural Resources. And personally, I've really appreciated Taylor's leadership both on soil health and ecosystem services in our state. So with that, Taylor, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heather, and welcome everybody. Yeah, it's just such a great pleasure to be here, and an exciting event that Alissa and Stephen and Heather and all the speakers have put together. So I'm really happy it's happening and glad to be part of it. I just want to give a couple minutes of kind of opening welcome from the Gunn Institute, who is hosting this session of the Northeast Healthy Soils Network kind of series. For those of you who may not know, the Gunn Institute is an interdisciplinary research center at the University of Vermont, where about 100 faculty and graduate students and postdocs and others collaborate to merge their expertise from across the university in order to address big environmental issues that are hitting Vermont and the world. We focus on 4 things more than anything else. Sustainable agriculture is one of them. Climate change solutions is another. Human health is a third, and resilient communities is a fourth. And we encourage and fund and support new groundbreaking research on those themes and how those themes interact. And all of you who are interested in soil health, I'm sure have noticed as I listed those 4 things that soil health is key to all of those themes of the Gunn Institute: sustainable agriculture, climate change, human health, and resilient communities. And so this topic is it spans kind of all of what we focus on at the Gunn Institute and all that we support. So anybody interested in hearing more about the Gunn or wants to get involved, you're certainly welcome to do so by just simply emailing me. So like I said, soil health, and like Heather mentioned, the importance of soil health is obvious to farmers and has always been. It's really hard to find someone who's against soil health, I'm sure. But it also is a really broad and a little bit vague idea. There are lots of dimensions to soil health, and there are lots of ways to define and measure it. And so while it's something we all value, getting specific about it is still a challenge. Also, I agree that soil health seems to be having a bit of a moment right now. Higher awareness generally among farmers and researchers and businesses and governments. Even right now, these months, Vermont has a working group on designing a payment system for soil health among its farmers. And so that's bringing together all those groups I just listed. So it's making the kind of need to measure soil health more reliably all the more timely and important right now, which is why this topic is just so great to be happening now. And there's lots of reasons that doing that definition and measurement better is important. We're going to get into that by several of the speakers, but I think it's going to help us have a a common understanding of what soil health actually means in detail. We're going to be able to know if agricultural practices, and especially new ones, improve soil health because we'll have a common way of measuring it. We'll also know if soil health is connected to other things we value, like water quality and erosion control and carbon storage and yields. And like I just mentioned, it'll help us support incentive programs and payment programs and other support mechanisms by having something that's a measurable outcome that we can compensate. So those are, among the many, many reasons it's kind of timely and important now. I think those measures are going to be challenging. I bet you everybody on this group already knows that, because they have to be several things at once. They've got to be relevant to what we care about. They got to be accurate, and they have to be practical. And there are trade-offs among those things. And that, I think, is one of the core challenges. So like I said, I am really looking forward to hearing from this great panel of speakers. I'm looking forward to this whole group of people making connections, especially new ones, especially connections among farmers and scientists and advocates and policymakers, because I think that blend of approaches is going to be important. Quick final thanks to Alissa and Stephen for putting this together, among other people. Heather for running it. Thank you, Heather. To the Healthy Soils Initiative for existing and launching this series. The speakers, of course, and everyone else who is participating along with them. So big gratitude from me, and I'll pass it back to you, Heather. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. Well, we're already on time, which is great. Thank you. Right now, then, we're going to launch into our panelists. And our first panelist this afternoon is Joshua Faulkner. And so I know, yep, we have your slides ready, Joshua. Joshua is a research assistant professor and a GUND affiliate at the University of Vermont. And Joshua coordinates the Farming and Climate Change program at the UVM Extension Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and does so much more out in the farming community as well. So Joshua, I'm going to turn it over to you. And as a reminder, just let us know when you would like your slides moved. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks, Heather. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited about today. I agree with Taylor that soil health is having a bit of a moment right now. And if you'll indulge me, I think, we're in this honeymoon phase, and the topic for today, the measurement and the outcomes, is forecasting kind of the hard work of a really long and fruitful marriage, though, because these are the things we have to sort out. And it's exciting to me as a researcher and extension professional to be working on these topics. But it's wonderful that we're starting this discussion here today, because these are the two of the biggest, I think, and most important issues surrounding soil health currently. Next slide. So I show this slide a lot in presentations, and I put it up here today because to me, it kind of captures what drives a lot of our work in my program to work on soil health. It's climate change, and it's extreme events like the one that caused this massive amount of gully erosion on this farm in Vermont after one single thunderstorm a few years ago. And we need to learn how to measure soil to prevent things like this, and more importantly, take those measurements, translate them to outcomes, and then into management for the farm. And there are plenty of unknowns still to go. So next slide. So what I want to do today is talk about two kind of broad topics. One are questions that I see surrounding measurement, and to sum those up kind of quickly, they would be, what should we measure in terms of soil health? And there are a lot of options, a lot of choices for folks, and lots of opinions on this. And then what can we measure? Really, what can we realistically measure in the field, given time limitations and cost limitations? And then what should we compare it to? And I don't have the answers to these questions, but what I do hope is that it will really spur some thought and conversation amongst the group. And I'm going to talk about one example of a suite of soil health indicators that we've developed over several years of work with an undergraduate class here at UVM. And then I also want to talk about what I consider some of the leading conundrums with soil health these days, and really that's I was a denier for a long time that there was, of course, there's this quantifiable relationship. This is studied between soil health and water quantity and quality, and really it's surprisingly understudied. And so I want to talk about some of our work that's trying to clear the water, if you will, related to this relationship, and try to put some numbers on it. So those are my two things I want to try to quickly do today in the limited amount of time. Next slide. Okay, so to start with, what can we measure? And for a lot of, I think for most people, this really the choice comes down to what commercial available testing package are you going to use? And these packages are there's the choice is growing. It's somewhat slow because it takes time for laboratories to develop their methods and their rating systems, and somewhat. Cornell's comprehensive assessment of soil health, the Haney, Solvita, there are some others out there. This is where most people look when they're going to measure soil health. And I think these are wonderful. They meet a very real need. But then at the same time, there are some costs associated with these. And not only is there the lab fee, which can be significant in some cases. There's shipping, and some labs require expedited shipping. There's some level of equipment necessary for taking the samples. And then there's the personnel. And so I recently had a research project and contracted with a group to do some soil health testing for me in a couple watersheds, and it was about $143 a sample, which is fine for us in research and others who have grants and base funding and such like that. But for farmers who have multiple fields, this adds up really quick. And I think that this is ultimately where we want to get to, is a place where farmers are using these packages. Farmers are using tools to evaluate soil health and then link them to outcomes on their farm. And I think we're not quite there yet. It's not accessible yet. And most of the people using these packages are folks like me and others who are doing research and extension and technical assistance. Common indicators in these packages, I've listed a few there. I'm not going to walk through all of these. This is what I believe I listed, what is in CASH, which is the assessment tool that I use, assessment package that I use most often. But then where I really see room for improvement here, and not to knock the packages, again, like they're wonderful. I'm glad we have them. But what they don't have are what I think of as aggregator metrics. Metrics that integrate a number of these base indicators to really point toward soil function and how that soil is performing, for example, during a rainstorm, infiltration capacity, things like that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those towards the bottom of the slide here. So recognizing what is out there and maybe some of the ways we would love to improve on that through a class at UVM, Advanced Agroecology, which I co-instruct with Ernesto Mendez, we've been measuring soil health with teams of undergraduate students for the past 3 to 5 years, using our kind of a custom package, if you will, to look and to try to track soil health over the long term on 5 partner farms, and try to evaluate the usefulness of these various aggregator metrics, if you will. And so we've been doing the CASH analysis, not every year, but we do this on an every other year basis. We've also included an earthworm count, which at 2 different depths, which is something that is not explicitly included in any of the other soil health testing packages, and something that is fairly simple to do. It takes time, but it's something undergraduates can do, or a farmer or a technical service provider can do. And then we include 2 of my favorite aggregator metrics. One is bulk density, which is kind of a bulk profile aggregation of how well that soil is forming aggregate, how stable the aggregates are, how well it's forming aggregates, how structured it has become, and likely how well it infiltrates water. And then for a number of years in this course, we've also used a sprinkle infiltrometer, which is essentially a very small rainfall simulator, so that we can evaluate a soil that for its true infiltration capacity in the field. And this actually proved a little difficult for undergraduates, and we dropped it from our suite this year, but this is one of those kind of pie in the sky. I'd love to be able to do this on farms everywhere, but again, it's an expensive piece of equipment, and it does take time. So this is, again, I'm not trying to say we're setting kind of a standard here, but these are the things we're exploring, different ways of measuring soil health, and it's been exciting. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to get into here is this kind of soil health and water quality conundrum, and it's complicated, right? And like I said, it's surprisingly understudied. There's more and more work being performed. There's been some really surprising results that have come out of the Western Lake Erie Basin. If anyone on this call is from there, I'm sure you're familiar with that work. That has shown a very unexpected relationship with improved soil health and reduced erosion and particulate phosphorus loss from fields, but then an increase in dissolved phosphorus loss from fields. And so this is one of the key things that we're trying to work on with some of our studies at Vermont, disentangling these whether it's nutrient management that's driving water quality, or whether it's soil health that's driving water quality. I see I have about a minute left, so I'm going to have to pick it up. Thank you, Heather. And most important of this, I think, is that we have good data to inform our payment for ecosystem services schemes that policymakers want to develop. So quickly, we're doing some watershed scale research. Next slide, where we're tracking water quality, and we're also measuring soil health across watersheds, across many fields within watersheds, and to develop that relationship at a watershed scale. And then you can go ahead and skip forward to my field scale research slide. And we're also doing this work at a much smaller scale. We're looking at what's happening within an individual farm field, measuring greenhouse gases, measuring water quantity and quality, and as well as a number of soil health indicators. And then last slide. And this is a project that we have with, I just lost it. We have a nice large plot scale study with Heather called Discovery Acres, where we're going to be able to track soil health and water quality at kind of the plot scale for hopefully a number of years to come. And that's super exciting. And I look forward to talking more about that in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Joshua. That 10 minutes goes fast. So sorry about that. But we're going to move right on and hear from Eric Roy, who is an assistant professor at the Gund Institute and with the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. So Eric, I will let you get going.
Thanks, Heather, and great to be here and share some thoughts with everyone. So I'm going to talk mostly about soil carbon sequestration, which obviously soil organic carbon is not all of soil health, it's part of soil health. So I'll focus mainly on that, and then I'll have some thoughts on soil health more broadly. Next slide, please. And so the first point is that measurements matter. As we pursue soil health, we pursue soil carbon sequestration, we need to measure outcomes and understand whether or not we are achieving those outcomes. And measurements are also what are really pushing us into this in the first place in some ways, with the understanding of increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and the consequences for global climate. Next slide. We've also have measurements now more and more of the amount of carbon that's stored both in above ground biomass and within the soils. This figure shows latitude on the x-axis, so this is the whole globe, and the amount of carbon stored above ground and below ground as you move to different latitudes. So you can see there's a lot embedded in this figure. I mean, one thing you see is at low latitudes, we have this spike in above ground carbon with high productivity ecosystems in the tropics. And then as we move to the northern latitudes, we see this huge store of carbon in the soils, in the soils, both in more surface level soils, but going deeper into the soils down to 200 centimeters. And this actually reflects two things. One, that we can increase carbon storage on Earth by increasing productivity, so above ground. And then what the northern latitudes show is that we can also increase carbon storage by decreasing the rate at which carbon is respired to the atmosphere. Next slide. And so in general, arable land or cropland is going to have less carbon stored compared to grasslands, which will have less than forests, which will have less than peatlands or wetlands. And so when we talk about increasing soil carbon sequestration on arable lands, in some ways, these are ecosystems that are already somewhat degraded in terms of carbon by a factor of them being converted from these other ecosystems into arable land at some point in time. And then depending on how they're managed, we can either sequester more carbon, build carbon back up in these systems, maintain what's there, or lose carbon due to practices like deficit fertilization, bare fallow, and drainage. And so it's really all about the balance of inputs and outputs. We have to bring new carbon into the soil through the production of biomass, and then that carbon needs to stay there and not be respired back to the atmosphere. And so there's a question as we're pursuing, the sequestration part of this, are we achieving that? And that's something I've been doing literature review on lately, and I'll share some results now. Next slide. And so the Nature Conservancy has done us all a service by collecting a bunch of information on past studies of the effects of different conservation practices on climate mitigation. And a caveat to start off, this data largely, or I think almost entirely, comes from the Midwest. So keep that in mind. This is not necessarily Northeast data that we're looking at right now, but we would think that it has some relevance for our systems as well. And so first, let's look at cover crops. And we'll look at a few of these graphs. So these, each little horizontal line is a different observation. So one thing I would point out first is that studies have found a wide range of results, both positive and negative, when it comes to the effects of cover crops on different aspects of climate mitigation. And then, the red on this graph indicates more negative outcomes, and the green indicates more positive outcomes. And so, some studies of some systems with cover crops are showing positive outcomes across these three dimensions: carbon emissions, carbon storage, and nitrogen emissions. But some studies have reported the opposite. And the averages tend for cover crops to not necessarily be firmly in the green. And so this creates some uncertainty. How do we ensure that we're actually achieving those green outcomes, those positive outcomes, versus falling into these orangish reddish areas? And that's an area of research right now. Next slide. And so same type of graph, this is instead looking at alternative tillage on climate mitigation. And so there's a bunch of studies included in this. And again, a lot of individual observations, and the individual studies shown here range quite a bit for these different outcomes. If you look at the left panel, conservation tillage, you see the average is a bit in the positive for carbon storage and for carbon emissions, but towards the negative of nitrogen emissions, where there were less data available. And then for no-till looks a little better on average here, but we still see this really wide range of results, which was surprising to me when I started to look into this data more closely. Next slide. And one interesting thing that folks aren't really sure what's going on completely, but the depth at which we take these measurements seems to affect the result in some ways. If you focus on the surface soil for no-till, for example, soil carbon storage seems to look better than if you take into consideration a deeper soil profile going to 60, 100, or 150 centimeters. And so there's some question. These are all compared to conventional tillage. There's some question of what's going on here, and we still need to do more work to understand what's going on below 30 centimeters when we enact these conservation practices. Next slide. So what about grazing practices? This is something I've been looking into as well. And there's a nice global meta-analysis of grazing impacts on soil health indicators. And some key takeaways from that study are that we see increased soil compaction under all grazing strategies and intensities relative to no grazing. But rotational grazing strategies can improve soil organic carbon and bulk density conditions over continuous grazing strategies. And greater continuous grazing intensity levels can negatively affect soil organic carbon. But again, here, site-specific environmental factors underpin soil function and health responses to management. Next slide. And a study, maybe some of you saw this, a study came out recently of a really well-known regenerative system, White Oaks Pastures in Georgia, looking at ecosystem impacts and productive capacity of a multi-species pastured livestock system. And so this land was degraded cropland that was converted to a regenerative livestock system. And they studied soil organic carbon as well as other indicators over a long time period. Next slide. And so they found with this strategy, they did build carbon back up in the soil in quite a profound way. So that was awesome. Next slide. However, there appears to be a trade-off with this particular system where in order to produce livestock using this system, it requires 2.5 times more land for the same quantity of food output. And so this is an ongoing debate within the research, scientific and farming community about these types of trade-offs. We know this system can sequester carbon, but it does require more land to produce this food. How do we weigh those different trade-offs? There's a lot of different ways of looking at that. Next slide. Another thing I wanted to point out that's a major point of emphasis in the literature is the fact that soil organic carbon tends to follow a logarithmic growth curve, meaning that it levels off or saturates at some point once the carbon inputs approximately equal the carbon losses by respiration. And there is evidence that supports this theory in agroecosystems. And I'm just showing here that this is what we would expect with any ecosystem developing and building soil carbon, that eventually it would essentially saturate and we wouldn't see more increase. And so what this means is that the more degraded soils have the more potential to sequester more carbon than those soils that already have higher soil organic carbon. Next slide. And so what about soil amendments? Compost, manure, biochar. I do a lot of work in this area. I think it's really exciting. Sometimes these materials are available and accessed locally, but it's important to remember that from a big picture perspective, they're ultimately finite. There's only so much compost, manure, and biochar out there. And we need to be careful not to just reallocate carbon from one terrestrial location to another. And that doesn't necessarily count when we're trying to sequester carbon. So some carbon market or payment for ecosystem service projects actually prohibit bringing carbon from outside of the project area into the area, unless you can prove that that material is actually increasing the rate at which carbon is sequestered from the atmosphere. Next slide. And so regenerative agriculture, you know, it's in debate right now. And this piece came out recently and stirred a lot of debate that it's good for soil health, but has limited potential to mitigate climate change based on a lot of the things I just shared with you today. Next slide. And the scientific community is really divided on this issue. There's really great researchers on both sides of the issue, some that are very skeptical of the climate mitigation potential of regenerative agriculture, some who see potential, even though they admit that sometimes that potential is overblown. Next slide. And one farmer's take that I found really interesting is, you know, they said the World Resources Institute was missing the entire spirit of regenerative agriculture, that it's not just about sequestering carbon, but it's about so much more. And maybe it's time to realize that our food system needs to do a whole lot more than sequester carbon, like pay farmers for the true cost of producing food. Next slide.
Hey, Eric, we're over
Okay.
time.
Okay,
Just
so let me
FYI.
just finish up here.
Yep.
Could you guys go back to my last slide just to make, so just to summarize, are some farms sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into soils? Yes. Should these farmers be rewarded for carbon stewardship? I would say yes, but there's a lot of uncertainty. We can't necessarily assume practices will increase carbon sequestration, and we can't model without having measurements to calibrate those models. And ultimately, we need to be careful about using offsets where we're trading the certain impact of greenhouse gas emissions for the uncertain benefits of soil carbon sequestration. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. That was great. A lot to think about here. All right, well, let's go on to our next speaker, Sarah Bay Nawa, the research coordinator from PASA, the Sustainable Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agricultural Farming organization. And welcome, Sarah. I will let you take it from here.
Great, thank you, Heather. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to share the work that we're doing around soil health down here in Pennsylvania. Like Heather said, I'm Sarah Bay Nawa, the research coordinator at PASA. And myself, along with Franklin Egan, the education director, are the research team that makes up PASA. And we're the spearheads of getting the soil health benchmark study done year after year. So next slide. Just to give you some background, this study started in 2016 with a core group of vegetable farmers. And since then, we've expanded to over 100 farms in Pennsylvania and now in Maryland. We've got 3 cohorts of farms represented. And within each of those cohorts, there is a broad spectrum of farming practices. We've been able to expand through the help of some partnerships with different organizations. And at the heart of PASA, we're an organization that seeks to facilitate knowledge exchange farmer to farmer. And so we were able to kind of get the study underway through such a great farming network that we have. Next slide. And yes, this study, it came about when we were hearing from farmers that they just really wanted to understand more about what soil health looked like on their farm. And they were really curious about how their soil health practices and outcomes were, how they stacked up against other farms of similar operations. So that kind of started us off. And we, are through all of this, keeping in mind these core NRCS soil health planning principles and trying to quantify some of these with data to help farmers benchmark their soil health practices against each other. Next slide. Yeah, so the main reason why we're able to have such a large number of farms participate is that farmers are very much participants. They help us gather data every year. Data comes in the form of these two main categories: field soil sampling. We sample 3 fields from each farm, kind of getting the farm scale aspect and getting a snapshot of what their rotation would look like on any given year. We send those soil samples up to the Cornell Soil Health Lab. We coach farmers the first year they're in the study, but we find that farmers are definitely willing to take soil samples for us year after year. The soil samples are at no cost to them, and it's they really appreciate having these results. But that is the way that we can have such a large study. Farmers also give us farm records. Hopefully these are records that a lot of them keep already for their own use, or that they need for any certifications. And they give them to us in various forms: a phone call, spreadsheets, web tools. This can be a challenge to get records from all the farms in the study, but we do our best and have a pretty good success, but it can take time to get a hold of farmers. Next slide. And yeah, so if some of you aren't familiar, this is the standard analysis that Cornell Soil Health Lab offers, and this is what we use for each of the field samples that we send up to them. Farmers mostly have never taken the time or had the funds to do a soil test like this for their farm, so they find it really interesting to see some information beyond a typical chemical analysis. The Soil Health Lab also does a ranking for each lab value that comes back. It's ranked against other samples of similar soil texture, and so farmers can get basically a percentile ranking from 0 to 100 to see how they stack up against other soil samples from the lab. Next. So what we do with some of those field records, we calculate some soil health management indicators, because we're trying to, figure out if what relationships exist between their management practices and soil health lab test results. So this is an example of some of the stuff that we calculate: days of living cover, organic matter inputs, tillage intensity index, in which we match their tillage equipment with stir value ratings from NRCS. We compile all of this and customize benchmark reports for farmers. You can see here, these graphs are all an example of a farmer's individual 3 fields in this study compared against other similar farm operations. So they really do see literally how their results stack up against other farms. Next slide. And so, yeah, like I said, we're trying to figure out relationships here. And so this is the results that we've seen thus far. This is looking at relationships between tillage intensity, which is on the x-axis, organic matter ratings from the lab, which is on the y-axis, and organic matter inputs, which are the dots, and size indicates how much they're putting on their fields. So this is interesting. Left is what we might expect to see, and the right is what is observed. So a little bit different of an outcome. And so you can go to the next slide. So this is where kind of sharing, getting farmers to talk with each other and sharing their stories really comes into play, because the graphs can only do so much. If we really want farmers to be able to take this information and share it with each other and improve their own operations and tackle common soil health challenges. So we do a lot of soil health learning circles in person. We usually do a big meeting once a year. We have conference calls throughout the year with each cohort, where they can come together, ask questions about to each other about benchmark reports, lab tests, results, etc. And it's a great way to start to facilitate that exchange of information. I will say that sometimes we come away with more questions than answers because, as we've been saying, and we all know, soil health is still very much evolving as we speak. We also do a series of case study articles every year to dive deeper into more specific one farm, and take a look at some of their challenges or successes, and as a way to share information. Next slide. And you can skip to the next one. Yeah, so this is another example of how we're trying to share the story of soil health. We've got now for some farms at least a couple years of information, and so this is just an example from a workshop we did earlier this spring where we were talking about actually tarping on small farms, and just we're able, because we have all of this information, we're able to bring up some soil health test results and their rankings from the lab and some of the field activity, and help to investigate further the story of soil health within a farming operations. And next. To finish out, we've got our soil health public report that we just put out. This is sharing for the first time publicly a bunch of insights that we've gleaned from the study thus far. You can find it on our website. We're excited that we're able to publish this and provide some insights for all of you. And that's actually all I have. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. It's very interesting to hear about, and I know many of us are aspiring to have farmer soil health teams as well, and trying to work towards these same types of programs. So thanks for sharing all this great information. And next we have Ellen Griswold, the policy director at Maine Farmland Trust. And it looks like your slides are up, Ellen, and it looks like you're ready. So I will let you take it from here.
Great, thanks so much. My name is Ellen Griswold, and I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with Maine Farmland Trust, we're a member-powered statewide organization that works to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming. And we've been operating in Maine since 1999. Next slide, please. But about 20 years into the organization's work, we adopted a new strategic plan, and stewardship and climate were one of our 4 main impact areas in the new plan. And you can see some of the objectives and strategies related to that impact area. But the big takeaway is that we see our work in this area both in terms of orienting our programming to be able to provide greater support to farmers in using climate smart practices or practices to build the health of their soil, as well as advocating for policies to provide farmers with that greater support. Next slide, please. So one of the first ways that MFT became engaged with the topic of climate was through a research project called the Natural Climate Solutions Initiative. We realized that we needed research specific to the benefits and costs of different agricultural and natural climate solutions in Maine, in order to both inform sort of farmer practice, but also to allow us to pursue appropriate policymaking. So we're currently partnering with the University of Maine, Wolfson Center for Agriculture and the Environment, and some other partners on this project, the components of which are sort of listed on this slide. Next slide, please. So the project is still underway and won't be finalized till the end of this year. But there have been some preliminary findings that have been shared. although just focused on the mitigation potential of many of the practices that we've been analyzing. But those preliminary results were able to inform the Maine Climate Council process and the state's updated climate action plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. But some of the preliminary findings, I think, are really sort of relevant to both the sort of context and how the updated climate action plan developed. And so I did just want to share a few of those. The first, just to provide some context, is that Maine's forests currently sequester nearly 70% of the state's annual gross greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because Maine is close to 90% forested. Maine's agricultural sector only accounts for about 2% of the state's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So those are some sort of important background pieces of information. But the study has found that increased usage of certain practices, like some of the soil amendments we've been talking about today, reductions in tillage, planting riparian buffers, cover cropping, and the use of multiple practices at once, really could significantly reduce Maine's agricultural sectors within sector emissions, and actually even cause the sector to be net negative. So those are some important findings so far, but again, the project will be finalized by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So before I move on to the updated climate action plan in Maine, I did want to note that the Natural Climate Solutions Initiative project that we've been partnering on with the University of Maine and others utilizes modeling to estimate the benefits and costs of different climate smart practices. And that's sort of modeling that, you know, is similar to the modeling that was used by the U.S. Climate Alliance when it conducted its Working Lands Opportunity Assessment. And while we feel like that is really great and very helpful initial research, we also recognize the importance of ground truthing those results and really seeing how different practices play out on farms in Maine. So as a result, just recently we launched with Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment, and in partnership with PASA Sustainable Agriculture, the Maine Soil Health Network, which will initially be supporting a cohort of about 8 farms in learning about the effects of different farm management practices on the health of their soil, in order to help farms decide which practices to use in the future. The farms will assess the health of their soils through soil tests and digital tools developed by Open Team, which is an initiative for using open source technology to capture and record soil data on farms, as well as to share insights and resources between farms. And as part of this project or this network, the farms will be participating in the benchmark study that Sarah was just talking about, and really be able to then learn how their soil data compares to the over 100 farms in Maryland and Pennsylvania that are participating in that study. Next slide, please. So how is this research impacting policy development in Maine? So some of you may be familiar with the Maine Climate Council process and its 6 working groups, which were created to basically come up with adaptation and mitigation strategies relative to their subject matter. I was part of the Natural and Working Lands Working Group, and we delivered our recommendations related to agriculture, forestry, and natural lands. And the entire updated climate action plan was finalized in December of last year. Next slide, please. So here are some of the ag-related recommendations in the updated climate action plan that are most relevant to our discussion today. The first is about providing financial incentives or support to farmers to adopt these practices. But you'll notice that although the plan signals the exploration of a multi-state sort of carbon program, and there were certainly discussions about payments for ecosystem services, the plan really sort of conceptualizes, at least initially, this type of financial support in the form of grants, as other sort of state soil health programs like in California or New Mexico have done. And I think that's in part because that seemed like the best way to get the most amount of financial support to the most farmers, at least in the near term. I also think that, you know, in Maine, given that Maine is 90% forested and our forested land play a pretty amazing role in terms of mitigation potential, I think that at least within the carbon sequestration context, there has just been more of a focus on the mitigation potential of our forest land over our agricultural lands. But that's not to say that, you know, the ag sector in Maine becoming net negative in terms of emissions would not be a really important development. It absolutely would. But one of the strategies that is contained in the plan is about developing a stakeholder process to create a voluntary incentive-based forest carbon program for small landowners in the sort of category of 10 to 10,000 acres. But most farms in Maine have woodlots on them. And so many farmers would likely be able to participate in such a program as well. But there are other goals, which I'll talk about in a minute, related to the development of the local food system. And so I think that even though we haven't been as focused on mitigation, there's certainly a desire to provide financial assistance to make farms more resilient. And then the others are about just the importance of providing technical assistance and research to farmers to be able to troubleshoot issues as they arise. The next slide, please. And so the second recommendation on here is really the important one, which is about, you know, out of recognition that we know that climate change is going to result in supply chain disruptions. We saw that a little bit with the pandemic. And so it's really important to grow our local and regional food system for food security for our state. And a big part of that is obviously ensuring that our farms remain resilient. So next slide, please, and I'll try and finish up quickly. So just to briefly talk about how we're kind of implementing these strategies, we have been working to pass the Maine Healthy Soils Program Bill, and I'm pleased to announce that that just passed through the Maine legislature on Wednesday, and it really will become function as a one-stop shop for information and financial support for farmers in terms of using climate smart practices or practices to build soil health. And then on the federal level, we are also actively working to support the Agricultural Resilience Act, which was just reintroduced on Earth Day by Congresswoman Shelley Pingree from Maine. And it really is focused on providing a lot of important tools to help farmers adopt these practices and realize the sort of adaptation and mitigation benefits that they provide. And the last bullet is just about how you can stay connected to MFT's policy work, although we just switched databases yesterday, and so there's a new link which I will put in the chat. But thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions whenever that's appropriate.
Great, thank you very much, Ellen. So many great programs that are happening. It's very exciting to hear about all of this work happening in our region. So we will continue with that. Our next speaker is Briana Alfaro from who is a soil carbon field researcher from Soul Fire Farm, and also a farmer at Sunheart Farm. So welcome, Briana.
Hi there. It's actually Briana, but that's common.
Sorry.
No worries. I'm used to that. You could also call me Bree. Yes, I did take on this position at Soul Fire Farm this year. It's a contract position, so I'm only short term with Soul Fire Farm, but I'm already really enjoying being part of that staff. And I have been growing for a few years and working with other farms, but this year I'm officially launching my own farm business. Yep. Next slide. Just a little about me, just I was trained in the understanding that positionality and identity is important, especially in research. I grew up in San Diego, so it's been incredible for me to do research in New York, starting with grad school a few years back at Syracuse University. Just a whole different landscape. That's why I wanted to show that beautiful oak tree in the nopales from San Diego. And the other photo is me working at my friend's farm, Catalpa Flower Farms. I do mostly cut flowers and medicinal herbs. And then I am a participant in the New York Practical Soil Health Specialists, coordinated by Cornell and AFT. I think I did see Aaron in the participant list. Hi, Aaron. He's one of the coordinators. And then lastly, I do have peasant and indigenous ancestors in both Mexico and Blackfeet territory, which I think colors and provides a lot of background for the work that I do. Next slide. So just briefly about Soulfire Farm. Soulfire Farm is an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. We are training the next generation of activist farmers and strengthening the movements for food sovereignty and community self-determination, which I see really reflected in this project. We work to reclaim our collective right to belong to the earth and to have agency in the food system. Next slide. I just wanted to include this quote. I want to know the story of my soil from Rafa Aponte from Rocky Acres Community Farm. He's not too far from me, so I hope to spend more time at his farm. Every conversation I had with him, he just has a lot of curiosity about the soil, really passionate about soil health, which I'm finding is actually across the board with all these farmers I'm working with. All the farmers on the project identify as Black or Indigenous, and this is part of the project. So Black and Indigenous farmers are using regenerative farming practices and ancestral strategies to reduce emissions and capture excess carbon. We know this anecdotally. There really isn't a lot of research on this. So this project is, serving a need. There's a huge gap between these two links. This project aims to document these healthy soil strategies, to understand the accessibility and effect of on-farm soil testing methods, and to record baseline data on the impact engaging with these tests has on management. So this is what really drew me to the project. After doing these tests in my previous position with NOFA New York, I was really wanting to shake out which of these tests actually are the most meaningful to farmers, which ones have the most impact. So I really jumped on the chance to work on this project with Soulfire Farm. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we're working with BIPOC farmers. We have 5 farms included in this project. Most of them are in New York and one is in Massachusetts. We're conducting pre and post surveys, pre and post interviews, before and after the farm visits, just to really get at that understanding of which are the most impactful of these tests. And they're all, for the most part, field tests. We are sending some soils to the UMass lab as well. So I have like a photojournalism background, so I like to use a lot of photos. So the tests that we're doing side-by-side comparisons as well, just to sort of get a little bit of understanding too of the differences that the different practices have as far as impact. And so the first test that we're doing is we're using a microbiometer kit, which you can see in the photo on the right. We just did those tests at Soulfire Farm a couple weeks back. And that is a little kit that we take into the field, and we use a little soil sample. And the microbiometer measures microbial biomass by releasing microbes from soil particles, and then we can take a measurement. And then the slake test, which many of you may have seen, this is a pretty common one, is the photo on the bottom left with the 2 jars. And in that test, we're just observing aggregates and how these aggregates hold together in water. This is one of my favorite ones. I just think it's really visually stunning. And we're generally trying to use contrast with this test. So we might be comparing like a no-till bed to a pasture, just showing how different management practices can have different results. And then earlier we heard mention of the earthworm count. We also do an earthworm count as part of this project, just with the understanding that earthworm activity is beneficial to soil health, and their presence is an indicator of microbial life. So yep, we're finding a lot of earthworms at these farms. Next slide. And then I included another quote at the top here from Leah Penniman: "The soil is alive, it's breathing." She recently talked about this project in a social media post, and she has a background in science education. So she's really excited to do all these field tests and sort of confirm what she already knows is, that they have really good soil health. They've been really working for years to build their soil there on the farm. So some of the other tests we're doing a basal respiration Solvita test, which was mentioned earlier as well. That's the photo with the bottom right with the color, the colors on the sheet. And then we're doing an infiltration test where we're looking at how quickly an inch of water infiltrates into the soil. So you can see us doing that bottom left. And then we are looking at soil hardness with penetrometer, trying to understand where we have compaction. And then lastly, we're using a Munsell soil color chart to look at colors of soil with the understanding that, different colors of soil are indicate different, composition of the soil, and blacker soils generally indicate more organic matter. So it's nice to kind of line these up and compare them. As I mentioned before, a lot of these farms are using a lot of different practices. They're diversified farms. They're producing vegetables, medicinal herbs. Some of them are raising livestock such as goats and chickens. They're keeping bees, and they're producing value-added products. They're practicing minimal soil disturbance, perennial polyculture, organic production, compost application. They use cover crops and crop rotation, as well as silvopasture systems that integrate nut and fruit trees, forage, and grasses. So at every farm, there's just so much to compare. I'm generally spending about 5 to 6 hours at each farm. I could easily spend 12 hours. So I have to be really choosy about where I want to compare, because these farms are really using a diverse set of practices, which is really incredible to see, and really inspiring for me as a farmer. Next slide. Oh, I guess that's the last one. So I tried to go short on this because I tend to go long, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A, and can move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Bree. That was a great presentation, and wonderful to see all the work going on and the tools that you're using as well. Some of those are certainly new to me, and so hopefully people have some questions about those at the end. Our next speaker is Julie Davenson. Oh, and look, it's already up there. Julie is the Executive Director of Stonewall Farm and Education Center in Keene, New Hampshire. So thank you, Julie. Thanks for joining us, and I will let you take it from here.
Great, thank you, Heather. This is exciting. I can't wait till we can all meet in person and actually be in a field and look at the soil and smell it and touch it. So hopefully we'll all be able to gather and do that soon through the Healthy Soil Network. Today I'm going to talk about ecological outcome verification. It's an assessment tool that farmers can use on the land to assess the health of the ecosystem. And this system, or this assessment tool, was developed by the Savory Institute And it is the science behind their land to market program, which is another certification program that exists. But unlike, say, an organic certification program, what this certification program is verifying is that the product or the ingredients from the product was sourced from land that was regenerating versus degrading. But they also developed this tool so that farmers could have a continuous improvement process to give them feedback on their management practices and the outcomes on the land. So and then it differs from other certification processes in that it doesn't dictate tools or practices, but it's focused on outcomes. And then based on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and within your context, that would therefore inform what tools or practices you use. Ecological outcome verification is fairly new, and it's employed by hubs throughout the globe that are involved with the Savory Global Hub Network, and Stonewall Farm is one such farm involved in that network. And we are working on bringing this to all of New England. So we're excited to collaborate with other farmers and organizations. We think this has a lot of potential, and it was developed by a community of scientists, some of which were involved with the study I noticed that Eric Roy had mentioned earlier from Michigan State University. And they were also involved with the White Oak Pasture study. So it's nice to see a community evolving around the development of these tools, and that it also includes farmers and researchers and other practitioners. Next slide, please. So what is EOV? It is an empirical and scalable soil and landscape assessment methodology that tracks outcome in a number of areas: biodiversity, soil health, and ecosystem function. It's taking a holistic approach, and as some of the speakers mentioned earlier, it's very complex to measure soil health. There's a lot of dimensions to it, and so it can be challenging to capture all of that information. And so we're focused on the water cycle and use different water infiltration tools to measure that nutrient cycling from the soil to the plants and animals and then back again, the flow of energy, photosynthesis from the sun, and then community dynamics, so the diversity of living organisms on the landscape that you're managing. And EOV measures and trends key indicators of the ecosystem function, which in aggregate indicate either a plus or a negative in trends in the overall health of the landscape. And all of the hubs that are working with farmers in their region enter this information in a database. And so similar to Open Team, there's a platform where all of this information is aggregating. And I know that they are talking with Open Team. So hopefully the more we combine these tools that are being developed, the more we can scale our knowledge and further develop soil health. And Open Team was a tool that Ellen Griswold had mentioned earlier in her presentation, and that has a number of partners across the country that are working to develop technology tools that help us assess soil health and health of our ecosystems in general. Next slide, please. There's what we call the EOV ethos, and the three things that are relevant to that is that one, it's contextually relevant. So it needs to be relevant to the people, the communities, the culture, the economies where it's being implemented, that it's outcome based, as I mentioned earlier, not focused on practices or tools, and that it's farmer first. And so it's farmer driven and led, and that it's an actual tool that they can use day to day as they're managing their land. And these are all slides from places that I've visited. The larger photo is from the Midwest in Iowa. I was there with a number of Savory Hubs training on holistic management and ecological outcome verification. And then the cows is a photo from here at Stonewall Farm, where we are practicing and learning that on a daily basis. And then the other photo is a photo I took at the Africa Center for Holistic Management in Zimbabwe in Africa. So it's been wonderful opportunity to see how farmers are implementing and bringing this to their communities throughout the globe. Next slide. So I'm going to just talk at a very high level about how we implement EOV and what the process is for that. It's very nuanced, and so there's a lot more detail involved in it. But the first step is when we're working to set up EOV in a region, we identify the ecoregion, and that map on the slide that you see is from the Nature Conservancy, and they've already done a lot of hard work in identifying different ecoregions throughout the world. And so we're looking at what is the climate, the geology, the vegetation, the landforms, and soil types. Also something called the brittleness scale. You know, how much rainfall does an area receive throughout the year, and how frequently. Then we look at land state transition. So within that ecoregion, what are all the different possible transitions or states could a land be in? So in that photo with the cows, again, that's here at Stonewall Farm, you'll see the grazing pastures, and just beyond on the edge of the fields, you'll see the forest, which, like Maine, is predominant in New Hampshire. And if we were to remove the animals from the land and let the land completely rest and recover, and not use any management practices, it would transition to the forested state that we see behind in that photo. And in fact, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as we all know, most of New England was deforested, and so, or New Hampshire in particular. And so this whole area had been clear cut. And lots of farms. And then as agriculture eventually left and moved in the West, this became forested again. And then you'll see in the foreground a grazing stick, and you'll see a close-up of some of the grasses in our pasture. And that was taken just this year in May, shortly after they grazed the land. And so the next thing, after we identify what are the state transitions, we look at the functional groups that exist. So we identify what are the rare species that would exist if our land was trending in a more positive direction, and what are the species that would represent poor transition, you know, indicated of poor soil quality, that sort of thing. One of the speakers earlier talked about looking at soil function and what's happening above the land. And so that's a lot of what this process does is, you know, it looks at the function of the land and how it's producing. And again, coming from that farmer perspective. Next slide. EOV metric summary. So the next step is we develop the metric summary, and also when we go to a specific farm, we complete satellite mapping of the farm and develop a monitoring plan for the farm with the farmer. And the monitoring plan includes both short-term monitoring, which is done once a year, as well as long-term monitoring with permanent transects, and that's done every 5 years. And then we calculate an ecological health index score that includes both absolute indicators and relative indicators. And here's just a photo of a class at the farm with the Savory Institute, and we were practicing ecological outcome monitoring in one of our pastures. Next slide. Trouble seeing. So there we go. So in the case of short-term monitoring, that's done once a year, every year. You do, depending on the size of the land base that you're monitoring, at least a minimum of 10 short-term monitoring sites per land base, and then that grows based on the size of the land. What we're looking for are predictive value about the direction of changes in the land using what's called leading indicators, things that you can see quickly and immediately. There's about 15 of those indicators that we're looking at, and they're all listed below here in the chart. Cool season grasses here in the north, we really don't have a lot of warm season grasses, so that would not be something we would necessarily include in our assessment here, but down in another part of the world, they would be using that. We look at bare ground, the living canopy, forbs, lagoons, litter abundance, things like capping, is the soil eroding, that sort of thing, living organisms, trees and shrub, dung decomposition, wind and water erosion, and warm season grasses. Next slide, please.
Hi, Julie, we're
Yes.
pushing time here.
Yep. Okay, I'm almost done. So,
Great.
and then long-term monitoring, there's a baseline that's completed every 5 years, same indicators as short-term monitoring, but we also include some lagging indicators, things like water infiltration, soil carbon, soil health, looking at biodiversity. You can see what we do in the permanent transect plot. There's a lot of detail and assessment that happens within those plots in terms of doing a catalog of all of the species that are located in there and taking photos in specific areas. Next slide. These are the different soil testing methods that we're currently using and combining along with the transects that we're collecting data on. You can go to the next slide. This is an example of some of the scoring categories that we have, looking at, for instance, in the top one, ecological health indicators, how we are interpreting that score and the scales, species richness, the Shannon-Weaver index, and the infiltration rates. You can go to the next slide. And then this is my last slide. And then in closing, I just wanted to talk about some of the benefits that I see with EOV and the potential. There's areas for improvement. I'd like to see more water testing combined with it, addressing application of chemicals, things like that. But the benefits that I see are, one, again, that it's farmer initiated, that it provides an opportunity for a continuous learning process. We use it on our land here, and it helps the farmers get immediate as well as longer term feedback. It's adaptable to your context. You're able to verify some of the outcome claims. A lot of people are talking about using regenerative practices, but we don't have a lot of tools to assess it. It is scalable. The methodology used in EOV is evolving, and the whole community that's involved in the development of this tool is involved in giving feedback to this process. So it's about the social aspect as much as the scientific aspect. It's holistic. I think there's great opportunities for citizen science and getting whole communities involved in evaluating the health of their watersheds. And more importantly, I think it empowers people, communities, and the farmers, the ranchers, landowners on the land. Here you can see a map. I was visiting with the Sisinda tribe in Africa, and they were sharing a map about some of the problems that they were working to overcome in their community, and what are the impacts of that, both socially, economically, and environmentally. You can see their tree and the connection there to bare land and poverty and overgrazing, and just how that's impacted their lives. So, and I guess that's all I have in closing. I do want to mention too that we are in the process of implementing this. So if more people would like to learn about it or get involved, just please contact me, because we're happy to share what we're doing and using with this tool, and would like to see other people be able to apply it on their land.
Great, thanks, Julie. We will wrap up our panel presentations by hearing from Brandon Smith, who is the Northeast Regional Team Leader for the Soil Health Division for NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And Brandon, we will let you wrap up the presentations.
All right, thanks, Heather. Great presentations by everybody. I just want to give kind of a highlight of what we do in the NRCS to measure healthy soils, and be happy to take any questions later. So next slide, please. I want to talk about two things first, and kind of stringing together what everyone has talked about so far. We have basically in-field or visual assessments that we perform to get an idea of what's happening with soil health, and then we have the laboratory assessments. So I just want to give an overview of the visual assessments and then spend a bit more time on the laboratory ones. Two of the main ones that are appropriate for New England and the Northeast are the Cropland Infield Assessment Soil Health Guide, Soil Health Assessment Guide, and the Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring, or the PCS as we call it. So next slide, please. So for the infield assessment on cropland, we basically have a lot of indicators that we show here. So in the left-hand column of that table, we have a number of indicators going from soil cover to, penetration resistance, that's using the penetrometer, water stable aggregates. I think we saw that Bree talked about the slate test, right? So a good way to measure aggregation in the field. Visual soil structure, visual soil color. How do the plant roots look? And what's the biological diversity like? So, we heard about earthworm counts from a number of presenters, and so what types of different organisms are you seeing in the soil, or is it totally devoid of any organisms? And so we have in this guide, we have, definitions and descriptions of all these different indicators, and then we try to link them to what we in NRCS call resource concerns or issues you may have on your land. And so in the far right column is the definitions we have for those. So we have compaction, organic matter depletion, aggregate instability, and soil organism habitat loss or degradation, which is always a mouthful. And so what we do is then we try to link these resource concerns to what the indicators are telling us. So that middle column shows those abbreviations and what we expect to see as a result of changes in those indicators. And then we try to link these to our conservation practices and actually prescribe or contract or plan or whatever word you want to use to get these practices or things you can do on your farm for conservation out on the land. So next slide, please. One of the things we do, if you look at the top here, it's hard when you go out in the field because there's all sorts of different things going on, right? You may have a lot of moisture. It may be droughty. You may have just tilled, things like that. So we identify the conditions that are needed for a particular indicator. So if you look at soil cover, for instance, it says basically, well, look at this anytime, really. And then we put some actual metrics on it, and we say, well, all right, 75% for this area is pretty much standard. So do you have residue or mulch around the year for more than 75% of the field? And then our planners can mark yes or no in these boxes. And so on and so forth for different types of indicators that I talked about. And then if you look in the bottom left, because you can't do all these indicators at the same time, there's some that you can put together to figure out if you have a resource concern, as we call it. So we have these decision trees in the bottom left, where these are all the indicators, for instance, that make up the ones that we attribute to compaction. And so then we bring these to a center area and we ask a question, is a soil surface platy, or are there two or more indicators that don't meet the assessment criteria? Again, this is like the assessment criteria that we put here in the red boxes. And and then we can follow through that resource concern decision tree. So some good things have happened. We only have this in a syllable PDF format, but Land PKS, the Potential Knowledge System, so they have an app over here shown on the right. Jeff Herrick has now integrated the NRCS's infield soil health assessment into his app. And so that's relatively helpful right now. And so not only can you get some results that are translatable to NRCS practices, but you can also do some additional scoring based on the Land PKS system. And then it's now being put into the Vegetation GIS system out of the University of Arizona, which is good as well. And this fits in with all the USDA computers and things like that. So it's certified so that our planners can use it on their system. So so that's a good thing as well. Next slide, please. Pasture condition scoring, just briefly. It's similar to the infield cropland assessment, but it's a bit different as well. There are the number of indicators shown in the table in the top right. There's about 10 of them. And they do something a bit different here, though. It's ranked on a point scale, whereas we have certain thresholds in the cropland infield assessment. This is based on thresholds. So as an example, for their first indicator, percent desirable plants, you assign a number of points based on a particular threshold that's defined for that point. And then you actually do more of a quantitative exercise where you add up all the points that you've given to these indicators, and then you kind of judge where you are in that particular field that you're in and what you need to do in terms of changes and how that would benefit the soil and soil health. So those are the two primary tools we use for visual assessment. Let's go to the next slide, please. So now I just want to talk about, so beyond that, and we've got this effort now about actually quantifying soil health in the laboratory and trying to get a standardized way to do that. And so shown on the left here is the technical note that was put out about 2 years ago. And even though it was put out 2 years ago, we started working on this in 2015, getting people from every stakeholder group together. And we got together in Oklahoma, and we all talked about this. We all ranked things. We all did polls, you know, and we tried to come up with the best sort of indicators that we could use to get standard measurements across the country. This was a first version. There's a new version that, you know, will come out in the next year or two, likely, because it needs to be updated as the science updates. But this is what we kind of came up with. And I say kind of because there's nuances to everything. And so basically, we've been looking at kind of having 5 primary indicators that we use to measure different processes in the soil, or different ways that we can indicate the function of the soil. The first one, soil organic carbon, that was by dry combustion. That was, you know, generally a no-brainer, okay? And, you know, we're using this to talk about or indicate soil organic matter cycling and carbon storage. And we chose this over loss by ignition just because it tends to be a more accurate and more precise measurement of carbon in the soil. Respiration was a tricky one. Respiration, so, you know, basically you're drying soil down, adding water to it, and seeing how much carbon dioxide is evolved from the activity of the organisms in the soil. We often refer to this as carbon mineralization, and we often say it's a good idea or good measure or gauge of what the microbes are doing in the soil. And so there's a bit to talk about on this, and I'll talk about it on the next slide. Active carbon, this was generally agreed upon as being a great indicator for us to measure. And active carbon generally is talking about the available carbon, or the labile fraction of carbon that's available for microbes as a food source, permanganate oxidizable carbon. So that was generally agreed upon. The next indicator is autoclaved citrate extractable protein. That's what ACE means. And so, you know, most of the organic nitrogen in the soil is in the form of a protein, right? And proteins are made up of amino acids, which are made up of nitrogen. And so this tends to be a very stable indicator of organic nitrogen in the availability in the soil. However, it's not necessarily one that's been widely adopted. And then lastly, wet aggregation. So this is taking the soil, and instead of doing the slate test in the field, you're actually bringing the soil back to the lab, and you're doing tests in the lab to see how much, during a wet or a rainfall event, how those aggregates are sticking together. So let's go to the next slide, please. So one of the things we've done is the 2018 Farm Bill said that the NRCS will institute a soil testing program. So not only for soil health measurements, but also for heavy metals. I'm not going to touch on the heavy metals at all, but I will talk about the soil health testing. And so this is what we're offering right now. We started in fiscal year, I think it was fiscal year 21, which would have been the last fiscal year, fiscal year 20, I'm sorry. And so we started then and basically said, let's do this basic soil health test where we use these 5 different indicators or methods below to come up with what we want to measure as part of our basic test. And I talked about all of these. We had to make some modifications, respiration, for instance. We originally had it just as a 4-day incubation, and now we're looking at 1, 2, 3, or 4 days. And so this is one package that we have that we're putting out for producers. And this 216 is called a CEMA, which is a conservation evaluation and monitoring activity. So not only are we using it to make some recommendations about what needs to be done, but we're also using it to see how effective the conservation practices have been. And then we're including a comprehensive chemical test. All right, next, please. And we also have a single indicator, which I'll just gloss over now, but it's in the technical note, and we have this available for folks who want to do some more in-depth analysis of the conservation practices. And then the last slide, please. Scoring and refinement. There was a lot of work that went into making sure that what we are measuring in the field actually is relevant to producers. So it's almost like a peer analysis. How do your soils relate to those that are very similar around you in similar conditions? Originally, there was the SMAF framework, which CASH now people talked about, capitalized on. And then the new one that we are going with is called SHAPE, and that's the Soil Health Assessment Protocol and Evaluation. And I have a link to that down here. But basically, looking in these red boxes, there's about 4 different properties that we take into account when we make these scoring curves. And one is texture, soil suborder, mean annual temperature, and mean annual precipitation. And so this way we're scoring like soils in like conditions, and we're not trying to compare a 6% organic matter soil in Vermont to a 0.5% organic matter soil in Texas. So this is part of a big project called the Dynamic Soil Properties Soil Health effort to gauge the soil health across the country. And then we're also working with this on our soil health demonstration trial projects, which Heather has one, and Vermont Land Trust actually has one too. So that yay for Vermont for having 2 of the first soil health demonstration trial CIGs. So that's all I have there. I think
Great.
That's the last slide.
Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to all of our speakers for taking time out of your busy schedules to share with us all these great projects and different organizations doing work in the area of soil health. And certainly much of this work is focused on farms, but mostly in the Northeast, but also other places as well. And, it's just amazing the kind of work everybody is doing. But it certainly does seem like we still have a lot of questions to answer. And The title of our webinar today is Measuring Healthy Soils and Ecological Outcomes. And we heard quite a bit about different ways that people are evaluating soil health, different measurements folks are using, but much of those are often called into question by different scientists, by the farmers themselves. Are they good enough? Are they robust enough? Are they cheap enough? Are they scalable? And I think some of those questions certainly do exist, but we're making a lot of headway. I mean, certainly when I started measuring soil health on farms in the early, 2000s, the Cornell soil health test was just getting off the ground. So I do feel like there's been plenty, lots of progress made, but I'm not sure if we're able to answer all the questions that we're looking to answer. So are we achieving the ecological outcomes that we want from healthy soil? And this is something that I heard Joshua talk about and Eric talk about maybe a little more specifically. Do healthy soils lead to better water quality? Do healthy soils lead to more water quantity? Do healthy soils sequester more carbon? And it seems like the verdict is still out on much of the answer to, if we have healthy soils, are we achieving certain ecological outcomes? And I think something that has popped up, maybe not in the chat box yet, but people were sending questions in that maybe we could address or discuss. And one of those questions really was, does measuring soil health actually show us everything we need to know about ecological outcomes? Is our focus too narrow with this ultra, I don't know, sort of excitement and narrow focus on healthy soils? I can't even believe I'm saying that, because it would seem to me it's a good start. And just with so much momentum, let's keep going with it. But I do think that is a really good point and question we should be asking ourselves. So what is it that we want these healthy soils to achieve? And again, presenters touched on different things they were looking at. And I guess I'll go back to Joshua saying water quality. Will healthy soils help us achieve this? And Eric saying, will healthy soils help us sequester more carbon? And I think defining what it is we want those outcomes to be, and then understanding if managing for healthy soils is a way to achieve that is really important. So, and then how do we know we're achieving it? And that goes back to the measurements. And so all of this is connected, and it feels like we're making great headway. We have so much momentum, but there definitely is still a lot for us to know. One important aspect that got brought up in several of the presentations, and just ending with Brandon talking about NRCS programming for the farming community, is farmer engagement. And we have good farmer engagement where we are in the Northeast, or at least in Vermont, and that's really exciting. But it certainly is a critical component of us being able to achieve those healthy soils. We can talk about it all we want sitting here on this webinar series, but unless we have the engagement and interest and motivation and excitement of landowners, a lot of it is really just a lot of talking. And I'm happy to say in the Northeast, we do have that engagement, but I also feel like we could engage more and do more to bring farmers and other landowners besides farmers to the table. So there are questions coming into the chat box, and if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can ask the question directly. But there was some interesting, a couple, I guess, questions, and this was coming from Greg Wilson asking about using remote sensing or satellite imagery to be able to, I guess, really easily pick up soil health and quality. Like, could we use that technology to help us better understand what's happening with soils on the ground? I don't know if any of our speakers can speak to that.
I can comment on that just a little bit. I think there is potential for remote sensing methods to tell us things about soil. I mean, methods are out there and people are starting to use them. I think the limitation that you will bump up against is the lack of bulk density measurements. So understanding more the physical structure of the soil and the stocks of carbon versus maybe just a % organic matter in that surface soil. So that's a limitation that you'll bump into.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And I just want to encourage also for the panelists, you can ask each other questions as well. So if you had something you wanted to follow up with one of your fellow presenters, please just raise your hand. So I'm not seeing any hands in the chat box yet, but there are lots of people there. I was told that they would rise to the top if they raise their hand, but I'm not seeing anything, so that's good. We have more questions that were submitted earlier, so I'm going to continue with those. Eric DeLuca, I believe you were asking about measurement versus modeling and the potential to use local data to build or calibrate these models. Can any of our speakers touch on that? Those models. Look at.
I'm waiting to see if anyone will.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just a disclaimer, I have been both a modeler and a field researcher. So I definitely appreciate the strengths of both approaches, but understand the weaknesses as well. And in my opinion, no model should be used that is not calibrated with field data, especially when we're talking about exchanges of money being involved. I'm skeptical of models in general. I think they can be useful tools. There's the old saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. I think that's generally true. But if we're going to use models, we just need to make sure we have a firm base of evidence to support the use of those models in particular locations.
Great. All right, I see Henry, you have your hand up, so please feel free to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, so I look at this from a climate change perspective, as well as a farming and human health side, but especially from a climate change perspective, it seems to me we're on a very short timeline. And I'm wondering, out of all the tools that you people are working with, do you see something that could be accelerated, could make the process so we were changing our land management faster in a positive direction, something that might meet that global warming deadline?
I can just speak to my personal opinion on that a little bit. So when I was working with NOFA New York, I'm coming very much from someone who's worked with farmers for a while and am a beginning farmer now. I really think incentivizing things like, compost, cover crop seed, coming up with incentives. We all know it's hard to make a living as a farmer, and also providing access to land, because I don't have permanent access to land. It's really hard for me to spend so much money on compost and cover crop seeds and everything, even though it's the thing that I want to do. And I have been doing it as a hobby for a couple of years, but this year is the first year I'm actually trying to break even. You have to make all those decisions and they're really hard. And I think if there was some support and for, you know, some of these costs, I think that that would be a huge help. Absolutely. And also, just, it's been mentioned before, like farmer engagement. And I see Carol Razel turned on her camera. She also knows this very well. I worked with Carol on a lot of these carbon testing projects when she was with NOFA Mass. But just, you know, holding up farmers as the experts and paying them well to teach other farmers how to do these practices. So like every farm has its own context, and you have your so much decision making that, you know, you can't just take a list of management practices and say, like, I'm going to implement all of these. You really have to decide on the best mix for yourself. And I think that takes these community engagement projects like the PASA program, et cetera. So that's sort of where I stand as far as like the best solutions.
Yeah, and I would just echo a lot of those comments. I mean, I think to really sort of speed up the rate by which farmers are able to implement practices that meet certain soil health principles, I mean, it's going to take a lot of investment and at different levels as well. I think it's exciting to see proposals, like I mentioned before, you know, Shelley Pingree's Agricultural Resilience Act, which would provide a tremendous amount of funding in the direction of not only financial and support for farmers, but also in increasing technical assistance and research, because I totally agree with that comment that how these practices play out can be such a sort of farm to farm issue. And it's really important when farmers are changing management practices to be providing them with the support to troubleshoot issues that are arising. And we just don't have anywhere near. I mean, it's amazing what cooperative extension, soil, water, and conservation districts and, you know, others are doing, but there's just nowhere near the level of support that's needed. And finally, I just also totally wanted to echo the increasing opportunities for farmer to farmer education and exchange of information. We held a Healthy Soils event in the county for potato farmers, actually right before the pandemic hit. And it was just amazing to see just how much was accomplished through farmers sitting together and talking with each other. And one of the things that the Maine Healthy Soils program will do is profile farmers that are using different practices with a high degree of success so that other farmers can reach out to them as the experts that they are.
That's super. I know we are kind of coming up on time, and this is a great line of conversation. There was something, Ellen, I believe it was you had sort of these 3 final points, and I think maybe this ties it together a little bit, but one of the top priorities was buying local. And, you know, we talked a lot about soil health and what people are doing to measure it and all the projects that we have going on, you know, research and is it making a difference to sequester carbon, so on and so forth. And then you just sort of put that out there like, okay, we also realize that if first of all, we need to have farmers close to us, because we know that as the climate's changing, there's going to be these pretty major interruptions in food supplies. So it's clear that we need farmers around us to be producing food in a way that protects the environment, which I think you also mentioned quite a bit. But that sort of then spins back around to what Bree just said is, it's hard enough just to produce food, let alone then have the same priority of also lifting this burden of like sequestering carbon and protecting the environment. And it's just really hard to make a living just producing food, which is also essential to life. I don't know where I'm going with this, except to say that I feel like we need farmers around us, and we're losing them at an alarming rate, even in our little, you know, especially in little New England, little Northeast and Vermont, and what happens when they're gone. And we haven't just supported the fact that we need farmers to produce food. And I think that's something that you're bringing up, Bree, and Ellen, you're recognizing as well. So what we didn't really touch on was that as a ecological outcome, which is food and healthy, sustainably produced food with that's being produced with the environment in mind. And we always say, well, if we show farmers that soil health improves yields, then they'll just do it, right? And I'm not sure if we've actually shown that yet. And I'm not sure. So I'm just going to put that out there for whatever. And Henry, I know this is close to you too. I see you, talking about this all the time. Like, we're losing farms. We need to keep them here. But how do we do that? Have places for them to sell good products where they can make money and invest that back in their land in a healthy way. So, comments?
Can I say something, Heather?
Yeah. Yes, please.
So I'll just make a quick comment about a couple of soil health practices surveys that I did at my time at NOFA Mass, and also we have one going right now at AFT, American Farmland Trust, where I am now. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly in those surveys when we ask farmers about, their struggles in implementing soil health practices is, I need more time. I don't have enough time to learn how to change my practices. I just have to, get my crop in the ground. So one of the things that I think about a lot is, how we do research on the ultimate sort of like the time increases involved in implementing new soil health practices, and then the time savings down the road once you've got those practices in play. For instance, potential weed population reductions and other types of efficiencies that might come about as a result of increasing soil health or implementing soil health practices. So I think that's one area where it could be really helpful to understand and study that transition period, which in the vegetable farming world I hear is about 4 to 5 years after you've reduced tillage before you really see a time savings. And that's just anecdotal because we don't have good research on that. But if there could be more research on sort of labor and time and other cost increases during the transition period, and then time savings after that, that might help farmers chart a better course for what that process might look like for different practices. And then also there might be some ways that programs and the government might be able to incentivize and better support people during that transition, farmers during that transition.
Thank you. And, Brandon presented last. There were some questions that came in about how can NRCS support, their quest for better soil health. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is really new, right, Brandon?
It is, Heather. Yeah. Yeah. It was a result of the 2018 Farm Bill, but it, of course, takes like a year or two to get implemented. And then there was COVID. And so, there's still a lot of interest in not only from the congressional reps, but from the USDA as well, in why we're not doing more in this particular area and why we're not providing more financial assistance for soil testing, soil health testing, and for the implementation of soil health practices. So yeah, I think it's going to get better fast.
Great. All right. Well, we have a couple more minutes, so 2 to be exact. Sorry, Ellen, go ahead.
One thing, which is, I think that was a really important point that was raised, because I think when we think about technical assistance in this realm, we often think about it in terms of helping farmers use certain practices on the ground, which is really important. But another part of the technical assistance piece that I think we don't often talk about is the need for business planning around this. So helping sort of farmers integrate the costs associated with this into their business planning efforts. And I think until we do that, it will remain a significant obstacle for many farmers to be able to change management practices in this way.
Thank you. All right. Well, we still have like a minute and a half left. People are asking about efforts to reduce, the cost of soil health testing. And I know NRCS, Brandon, providing cost share for those is helpful, but not everybody signs up for federal programming. I know it is a goal, and a priority to have services that are affordable, and that remains a challenge. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. And part of it is that it's so complex that there's many things that need to be measured to evaluate the health of the soil. It's not as simple as just maybe looking at the nutrients, which is not simple either, but we're trying to look at the whole system, and whole system analysis is costly. All right.
I agree. Oh, sorry,
Thanks,
Heather. I was
Brandon.
just
No,
going to say,
go,
you know,
go.
I think the more, though, you know, we're kind of on the leading edge of this still. And I think the more adoption that there is, the more the price goes down, and the more, you know, affordable and accessible it will be to a lot of people. So I think, you know, in a couple of years, it'll be a bit of a difference in terms of price for soil health testing.
Yeah.
At least I hope.
I hope so too. Well, we are at 3 p.m. right on time, and I want to thank all of our speakers, the panelists, and all the organizers, Alissa and Stephen and others I know who also contributed to this great series today. Thank you for inviting me as the moderator. I hope that I helped and not hindered. And everyone, is there a soil health song? There probably is, but next time we should sing it. And it should be cheerful, like I don't know, I'm terrible singer. I would never write a song, but if anybody can get on that, I think it'd be good. Just like do a little cheer, maybe a cheer, not a song, just like a cheer. We'll work on that next time, right, Alissa? She's doing a postdoc and she's like bored, so now she can write a cheer. Yep, see?
You're the boss.
Anyway, thanks everyone. What a great time. It was nice seeing you all and meeting everybody. Have a wonderful day and get out there and take care of the soil.